What if I told you that the dessert sitting at the center of your birthday table has a history older than most nations on Earth? That the slice of cake you casually cut, frost, and post on Instagram carries within it thousands of years of agricultural innovation, trade routes, religious ritual, chemistry, industrial power, and cultural symbolism? This isn't just sugar and flour. This is civilization baked into a pan. And today, we're going deep, all the way back. The story of cake does not begin with buttercream. It doesn't begin with birthdays. It doesn't even begin with ovens. It begins with grain. Long before anyone used the word cake, human beings were grinding wild grasses into coarse meal. Around 10,000 years ago, during the Neolithic agricultural revolution, communities in the Fertile Crescent began domesticating wheat and barley. Once grain could be harvested and stored, something changed in human society. People could settle, they could build, and they could experiment. The earliest ancestors of cake were not fluffy, sweet, layered desserts. They were dense mixtures of crushed grain and water, pressed into flat shapes and cooked on heated stones or in ashes. These early grain cakes were closer to flatbread than dessert, but they marked the technological starting point. Grinding stones, controlled fire, and eventually primitive ovens created the possibility of transformation through heat. By around 3000 BCE, in ancient Egypt, we see a major leap. The Egyptians mastered not only bread making but fermentation. Archaeological evidence from tomb paintings and preserved loaves shows that they understood how wild yeast could make dough rise. Now here's the key difference. Most bread was everyday sustenance, but certain breads were enriched. Honey, dates, figs, and nuts were incorporated into ceremonial loaves. These were sweeter, denser, richer. They weren't everyday fuel, they were special. Egyptian bakers were using emmer wheat, grinding it into flour, mixing it with honey and fruit, and baking it in conical clay ovens. These honey-sweetened breads are widely considered the earliest true ancestors of cake. They were often used in religious offerings. That's important. From the beginning, sweetened baked goods were associated with ritual, status, and celebration. As trade networks expanded across the Mediterranean, ideas moved. The Greeks inherited and expanded Egyptian baking knowledge. By the 5th century BCE, Greek bakers were producing a variety of sweetened baked goods. One notable example was plakous, a flat cake layered with cheese, honey, and sometimes nuts. It was baked and then soaked in syrup. This is a direct structural ancestor of later cheesecakes and syrup-soaked desserts. The Greeks also refined grinding techniques, improving flour texture. They incorporated olive oil and sometimes goat's milk cheese into their sweet bakes. These weren't airy sponge cakes, but they were intentionally sweetened and structured differently from bread. Cake was separating itself from loaf. Then Rome enters the picture. As the Roman Republic expanded, it absorbed Greek culinary traditions. Roman cooks documented recipes. In the 1st century CE, the Roman cookbook attributed to Apicius includes several sweet-baked preparations. If you're into real food history, no myths, no Pinterest fairy tales, no fake medieval legends, hit subscribe right now, because this channel breaks down how everyday foods actually shaped the world. One Roman cake, also called placenta, derived from the Greek plakous, involved layers of dough and cheese baked with honey. This wasn't birthday cake, but it was a structured, multi-component sweet bake. Romans also developed fruitcakes made with dried fruits, nuts, and honey. These were durable, portable, and calorie-dense, ideal for soldiers and travelers. Sweetness still came primarily from honey, because refined sugar was not yet common in Europe. Sugarcane existed in India and parts of Southeast Asia, but it had not transformed Mediterranean baking yet. After the fall of Rome, Europe entered the early medieval period. Baking techniques did not disappear, but luxury ingredients became scarcer in many regions. Honey remained the dominant sweetener. Medieval cakes were often dense, spiced breads enriched with dried fruits. Spices like cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg, once global trade routes reconnected Europe to Asia, became markers of wealth. If your cake contained imported spices, you were signaling status. During this time, fruitcakes began to take recognizable form. They were heavy, preserved by sugar and alcohol, and often made for feast days. Cakes were no longer just offerings to gods, they were tied to Christian holidays. Feast days meant indulgence, and indulgence meant enriched bread evolving further away from everyday loaves. Now we hit a turning point. Sugarcane cultivation spread westward from India through the Islamic world. By the medieval period, sugar was present in parts of Europe, but remained extremely expensive. It was treated almost like a spice or medicine, Only the wealthy could afford significant quantities. Everything changes between the 15th and 18th centuries. European colonial expansion established sugar plantations in the Caribbean and the Americas. This expansion was deeply tied to the transatlantic slave trade, a brutal system that powered the rise of cheap sugar in Europe. As sugar became more accessible, sweetness shifted from rare luxury to increasingly common ingredient. With greater sugar availability, bakers could move beyond honey. Refined sugar allowed finer textures, lighter crumb, and new techniques. This is when cake begins its transformation into something closer to what we recognize today. By the 17th century, advancements in milling technology produced finer wheat flour. Instead of coarse meal, bakers could now access sifted, refined flour. That matters. Texture is everything in cake. Finer flour allows lighter structure. Eggs also become central. Bakers discovered that beating eggs, especially whipping egg whites, incorporated air into batter. Air equals lift, lift equals lightness. This was a breakthrough. Before chemical leaveners, air and yeast were the primary options. Yeast produces a bread-like flavor and requires time. Whipped eggs create immediate structure. Sponge cake emerges in Europe as a distinct category. Instead of relying on yeast, sponge cakes relied on egg foam for volume. This is a fundamental shift. Cake is no longer bread's cousin. It is its own culinary identity. Another major innovation arrives in the 18th century. Chemical leavening. Early American bakers used potash, derived from wood ashes, as a leavening agent. Potash produced carbon dioxide when combined with acidic ingredients. It wasn't perfect, but it was a precursor to modern baking soda. In the 19th century, baking soda and later baking powder were commercialized. Now cakes could rise reliably without yeast or extensive egg whipping. Texture became predictable. Home baking expanded dramatically. Cakes became softer, taller, and more consistent. And now tell me in the comments which well-researched food history you want next. The pound cake, documented in the early 1700s in Britain, represents the structured precision. The recipe was simple: 1 pound of flour, 1 pound of sugar, 1 pound of butter, 1 pound of eggs. No guesswork, equal ratios, dense, rich, stable. This formula reflected increasing standardization in measurement and ingredient availability. As the Industrial Revolution accelerated in the 19th century, sugar production skyrocketed. Flour mills became mechanized. Ovens improved with cast iron and later temperature control. Middle-class households gained access to ingredients once reserved for elites. Layer cakes began appearing more frequently in the 19th century. Instead of a single dense loaf, bakers split cakes horizontally and filled them with jam or custard. Frosting evolves alongside. Sugar refinement. Early icings were often boiled sugar glazes. Later, buttercream and meringue-based frostings developed as sugar quality improved. The association between cake and celebration intensified during this period. Wedding cakes, for example, evolved from earlier European traditions of stacking sweet buns. In Britain, elaborately iced, white wedding cakes became symbols of wealth and purity. Refined white sugar was expensive. A white cake signaled status. Birthday cake traditions also solidified in the 18th and 19th centuries. In parts of Germany, children's birthday celebrations, called Kinderfest, included cakes with candles. Candles symbolized life and light. Over time, this practice spread and became normalized in Western culture. By the early 20th century, cake was no longer rare. It was mainstream. And then came one of the biggest democratizing forces in baking history: packaged cake mix. In the 1930s and especially post-World War II America, companies developed shelf-stable cake mixes requiring minimal ingredients. Brands like Betty Crocker turned cake into an accessible weekday activity. No advanced technique, no precise measurement of flour. Just add eggs, oil, water, mix, bake. This changed domestic baking culture permanently. Cake became not only celebratory, but convenient. Suburban households embraced it. Marketing campaigns framed baking as an expression of love and modern domestic competence. Meanwhile, professional pastry chefs continued innovating. French pâtisserie refined genoise, dacoits, and opera-style layered constructions. Austrian bakers perfected chocolate torts. American bakers experimented with chiffon cake in the mid-20th century, combining oil and whipped egg whites for ultralight texture. Globally, cake diversified. Japanese castella cake, originally influenced by Portuguese traders in the 16th century, evolved into a distinct sponge tradition. Latin American tres leches cake soaked sponge in milk mixture, creating a completely different textural experience. Black Forest cake in Germany layered, chocolate sponge with cherries and cream. Despite regional variations, the structural backbone of cake remains consistent: flour for structure, sugar for sweetness and moisture retention, fat for tenderness, eggs for binding and aeration, and leavening for rise. Modern cake science is deeply rooted in chemistry. Sugar competes with flour for water, limiting gluten formation and keeping cakes tender. Fat coats flour proteins, preventing toughness. Eggs provide emulsifiers. Baking powder releases carbon dioxide in stages, ensuring lift during both mixing and baking. Temperature control also matters. Ovens evolved from wood-fired clay chambers to gas and electric systems with precision thermostats. This consistency allowed reproducible results, essential for commercial bakeries and large-scale production. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, cake entered a visual era. Television baking competitions, social media platforms, and hyperrealistic fondant sculptures transformed cake into edible art. But underneath the mirror glaze and sculpted fondant, the historical structure remains. Cake has always reflected technology, trade, economics, and power. Honey from ancient beekeeping, sugar from global colonial networks, flour from industrial mills, chemical leaveners from laboratory chemistry. Cake is not just dessert, it's a timeline of human progress and human cost. Even today, trends reflect broader cultural shifts. The rise of gluten-free cake corresponds to modern dietary awareness and alternative grain production. Vegan cakes rely on plant-based emulsifiers and chemical precision rather than eggs. Keto cakes experiment with almond flour and sugar substitutes, reflecting changing nutritional priorities. But here's what hasn't changed. Cake marks moments: birthdays, weddings, graduations, anniversaries, promotions, even farewells. Across centuries and continents, when humans want to commemorate something, they sweeten grain, apply heat, and share slices. From stone-heated grain patties in prehistoric settlements to multi-tiered wedding masterpieces in climate-controlled bakeries, cake's journey mirrors civilization itself. It evolved from survival food to sacred offering, from elite luxury to household staple, from dense honey bread to feather-light sponge. And if you think about it, that's wild. The next time you cut a slice, you're participating in a tradition thousands of years old, shaped by farmers, millers, traders, enslaved laborers, chemists, bakers, and families across generations. That's real food history. No fantasy, no exaggeration. Just documented evolution through agriculture, chemistry, and culture. If this deep dive changed the way you look at cake, drop a comment with the word slice. Subscribe for more long-form, no-nonsense food history that actually respects the facts. And next time you blow out candles, remember, you're not just making a wish. You're standing at the end of a timeline that started with crushed grain and fire. That's the story of cake.